Welcome, everyone. Welcome. My name is Tim Bradley. I'm a senior here at Notre Dame and the president of Students for Child-Oriented Policy. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, Truth Overruled, the Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom. I want to remind you that our speaker's book by the same title will be on sale at the conclusion of the lecture. It's on sale for $16.99, and there's also a faculty and staff discount if you are a faculty member. And you can pay in cash, credit, or debit. Ryan will also be available to sign copies of the book, and he'll be up there at the top if you want him to sign your copy. Before we get started, I just want to say a few words of thanks and recognition of those who helped to make this event possible. First, thank you to Professor Philip Munoz, who could not be with us tonight, and the Tocqueville program, which he directs, and also to the Love and Fidelity Network out of Princeton, New Jersey, for co-sponsoring tonight's event. I'd also like to thank Mia James of the Student Activities Office, Shyla Atkinson, the building manager of DeBartolo Hall, and Colleen Jones and the staff of the Notre Dame Bookstore for all of their support. I'd especially like to thank Jen Smith of the Tocqueville program for her tremendous help, as always, in organizing tonight's event. And last but not least, thank you to all the members of Students for Child-Oriented Policy for all of their hard work, and especially to Luis Aranya Salmarón, who took the lead in organizing the event. And I'm going to hand it over to Luis to introduce our speaker, and then we'll get started. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. So I've been given the honor to introduce Ryan, kind of personal hero of mine, a bit of a fanboy. But Dr. Ryan T. Anderson is the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow in American Principles and Public Policy at the Heritage Foundation, and he's the founder and editor of Public Discourse, the online journal of the Witherspoon Institute of Princeton, New Jersey. He's the author of the just-released book, Truth Overruled, The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom, and co-author with Princeton's Robert P. George and Sirif Girgis of the book, What is Marriage? Man and Woman, A Defense. Justice Samuel Alito cited his book twice in his dissenting opinion on the Federal Defense of Marriage Act case in 2013, and Justice Clarence Thomas cited Anderson's research in his dissenting opinion in the 2015 Supreme Court marriage case. Anderson received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Princeton University, graduating Phi Beta Kappa and magna cum laude, and he received his doctoral degree in political philosophy from the University of Notre Dame. His dissertation was titled Neither Liberal Nor Libertarian, A Natural Law Approach to Social Justice and Economic Rights. Anderson has made appearances on ABC, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, and Fox News, including appearances on This Week with George Stephanopoulos and Piers Morgan Live. His work appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, First Things, the Weekly Standard, National Review, and the Claremont Review of Books. Anderson is currently under contract with Oxford University Press, writing a book with John Corvino and Sharif Girgis on religious liberty. And please welcome Dr. Ryan Anderson.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming, and I'm happy to be back at my alma mater. It was this time last year that I finally defended my dissertation, and so it's good to be back as Dr. Anderson rather than as ABD, which can kind of hang over your head for years and years on end. What I want to do today is just spend a little bit of time going through some of the arguments that I make in this new book. I think eventually I'm going to walk through chapter by chapter, but I want to put it in a larger context of why anyone should care about this. And so I want to start by saying it was 50 years ago that Daniel Patrick Moynihan issued his famous report on the state of the black family in the United States. And at the time, Moynihan was pointing out that while births to single mothers in the general population were in the single digits, within the African American community, births to single mothers were beginning to approach 25%. Moynihan was roundly criticized for being a racist because he issued this report. Even though he was a liberal senator from the state of New York, he was a liberal professor at Harvard University, and he had issued the report precisely because he wasn't a racist. Moynihan was concerned that something was going on within the black community, that their marriage rates were declining, and that now a quarter of their children were being born outside of marriage. marriage. And he said this is going to have severe consequences. It's going to have consequences for those children, for those families, for those communities, and for the broader society. Fast forward to today. Today, 40% of all Americans are born to single mothers, 50% of Hispanics, and it's over 70% of African Americans are born to single moms. So remember, Moynihan's time, it was single digits for the general population, 25% for African American children. Today, it's 40% for the general population, 50% for Hispanics, 70% for African Americans. Gays and lesbians didn't cause this problem. Straight people did. This problem with the decline of the marriage rates, with the increase of non-marital childbearing, is a direct consequence of the sexual revolution and the values that it began promulgating about the family in the United States. The problem with Justice Kennedy's ruling from just a few months ago was that it enshrined the vision of sexuality and the vision of marriage and the vision of family that the sexual revolution gave us into our Constitution. So if you think that the past 40 or 50 years of marriage practice in the United States has been a good thing for children, a good thing for women, a good thing for families and communities, what has happened in the past 40 to 50 years? This is where we've seen the rise of non-marital childbearing. This is when we've seen the introduction of the hookup culture. This is where we've seen the introduction of no-fault divorce laws and then the more than doubling of divorce rates in the United States. This is when we've seen in many communities, more or less, the dissolvement of the institution of marriage. If you think that's been a good thing for human well-being and for human flourishing, then by all means cheer on Anthony Kennedy's decision. But if you think that this has been problematic in many respects for human well-being and human flourishing, then you might want to be cautious before having 5 unelected judges redefine what marriage is and then say our Constitution requires it. And the reason I start this way is to highlight that the problem here is not so much, or not exclusively, the same-sex part. The problem here is the marriage part. The legal redefinition of marriage could only take place after the cultural redefinition of marriage. It's only after 50 years of heterosexuals making a mess of love and sex and the family, with non-marital childbearing and high rates of divorce, that Anthony Kennedy could say the male-female part doesn't matter either. So it's only after heterosexuals make a mess of exclusivity and fidelity and permanence and monogamy that sexual complementarity can be viewed as optional as well. Had the cultural redefinition not taken place, the legal redefinition wouldn't have taken place. Because at the heart of Anthony Kennedy's ruling for the 4 liberals and himself on the court isn't a legal argument. His opinion's not really based on jurisprudence. It rarely even cites previous Supreme Court cases. It doesn't engage seriously with the relevant precedents. At the heart of Kennedy's opinion is a philosophy of marriage. He even says repeatedly throughout his opinion that it's being driven by new insights into marriage. So whether you think those new insights are good or bad, they're not something that the Constitution required. So let me say a couple of things about what to do now, and then I'm going to run through briefly some of the arguments within the book. The overarching argument of the book is that the marriage movement should model itself on the pro-life movement. It should learn from the successes of the pro-life movement. And there are 3 themes that are repeated throughout the book. The first is that the ruling is judicial activism. That just like Roe v. Wade is judicial activism, there's nothing in the Constitution that actually says that there's a constitutional right to have an abortion. There's nothing in the Constitution that says a right to privacy extends to a choice to kill an unborn child. So too, there's nothing in the actual Constitution that required a redefinition of marriage. Whether as a policy matter you think same-sex marriage is a good idea or a bad idea, whether as a voter you would vote for same-sex marriage or vote against same-sex marriage, as a constitutional matter, this is actually a rather easy question. The 14th Amendment and the Constitution as a whole is silent on whether marriage is a gendered or a genderless institution. The 14th Amendment, the Constitution as a whole, doesn't tell us what marriage is. So the book that I had co-authored with a classmate of mine at Princeton and with a professor of ours there was titled, "What is Marriage?" precisely because we thought that was the driving question in this debate. Everyone's in favor of marriage equality. Everyone wanted the law to treat all marriages equally. The question was, what sort of a relationship is a marriage? And it was only if you could answer that question, the what is marriage question, could you say whether or not the 4 state laws that were before the U.S. Supreme Court from the Sixth Circuit, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Michigan, you could say whether or not their laws were respecting marriage equality or violating marriage equality. And so the only way that Kennedy could conclude that they were violating equality was to smuggle in his own vision of marriage that sees marriage as primarily about consenting adult romance and caregiving. If you read through his opinion for the court, it's not legal reasoning that takes place, it's freshman philosophizing about what marriage is. And he more or less says that marriage is about consenting adult romance and caregiving, and what the philosopher John Corvino has called your number one person, establishing the relationship with your number one person. That vision of marriage isn't required by our Constitution. It's not something that has been part of our history, our traditions, our practices, and it's not what the citizens of those 4 states voted on. And so it's simply an instance of legislating from the bench, judicial activism. Which is what happened in Roe v. Wade, and it's what was important that the pro-life movement never accepted Roe v. Wade as the last word about abortion. 42 years later, every January 22nd, hundreds of thousands of Americans go to Washington, D.C. to protest the Roe v. Wade decision, to say that the Supreme Court doesn't get the last word on unborn human life, that the Supreme Court told a lie about unborn children and it told a lie about the Constitution. I think in a very similar way that needs to take place on this marriage issue, that Anthony Kennedy has told a lie about our Constitution and about the nature of marriage, and that it's not the last word on either of those important issues. That's more or less the 3rd chapter of the book. The 3rd chapter goes through what Kennedy said and why, and then it goes through the 4 dissenting opinions and why those 4 dissenting opinions got it right. But I want to back up to the very first chapter, because it's in that first chapter that I summarize some of the arguments from our previous book, saying that there are 2 visions of marriage on offer. There's the vision that came out of the sexual revolution, the vision that says consenting adults should do whatever consenting adults want to do, that love equals love, that love makes a marriage, that marriage should last as long as the love lasts. None of those slogans were created in the past decade. All of those slogans were around in the 60s and the early 70s during the sexual revolution. In our previous book, we actually opened with a wedding announcement from the New York Times of a straight couple to show that many heterosexual relationships are informed by this vision of what marriage is. It's a vision of marriage that says it's primarily about the desires of adults. It's about consenting adult romance of whatever size or shape the adults most prefer. And on this vision of what marriage is, it makes no difference whether it's a same-sex or opposite-sex relationship, because any consenting adult can consent to love each other and care for each other and have a joint checking account and cook meals for each other. And if that's all that marriage is, it wouldn't make a difference. But what I point out in that first chapter is that there are actually very sound philosophical reasons for thinking that marriage is inherently a union of sexually complementary spouses. That marriage is about uniting comprehensively as one flesh. And that the only type of union that can unite comprehensively is going to be a union of sexually complementary spouses, a union of a man and a woman who unite in an act that makes them one flesh, that unites them at all levels of their humanity, a union of hearts, minds, and bodies. And that the state takes an interest in this relationship as opposed to other consenting adult relationships, because this is the relationship that has the capacity to create new life. That the act that unites a man and a woman as husband and wife is also the act that can make them mother and father. That it makes them one flesh, both in that conjugal action, and it can make them one flesh in their children. And so the state's interest in marriage is in getting a man and a woman to commit permanently and exclusively to one another, so that any children that that union might produce will have both a mother and a father. That when this doesn't happen, social costs run high. The reason that Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote that report 50 years ago was because he was seeing the social costs that were running high within the African American community back then, and they've only been exacerbated today. Don't just take my word for it. I go through lots of the social science studies in that chapter. Let me just read you one quote, and I'll ask you who this speaker is. We know the statistics. Children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They are more likely to have behavioral problems or run away from home or become teenage parents themselves. And the foundations of our community are weaker because of it. Which right-wing activist nutjob said that? Take a guess. President Obama, before he evolved. Now, why did President Obama say this? He gave an answer to this when he addressed the all-male graduating class of the historically black college, Morehouse College. He said to the graduates, quote, "I have tried to be for Michelle and my girls what my father was not for my mother and me. I want to break that cycle." And so President Obama is a perfect illustration that you can beat the odds. President Obama is clearly living a flourishing life. He's had a successful life. Regardless of your politics, regardless of what you think of his administration, it's hard to deny that he and Michelle and their 2 daughters are leading the American dream. And yet he's spoken out against fatherlessness precisely because he knows he beat the odds, that he had a more challenging road in life, that he had a tougher road to hoe, precisely because of the family structure into which he was born. And so he was encouraging that all-male graduating class to man up, that he wanted them to be good fathers, to be good husbands, precisely because he experienced it firsthand. And that he now wants to be for Michelle and his daughters what his father wasn't for him and his mother. Which raises the question of what will happen if marriage is redefined. How does the pre-evolution and post-evolution Obama remain consistent? Because what I argue in the second chapter is that redefining marriage will fundamentally undercut the state's interest in the marital relationship and why the state got in the marriage business in the first place. And I go through this in 4 steps in that chapter. This is the question that I find most students would have is, how does allowing Adam and Steve to get married impact you or your marriage? What's the harm? What's the big deal about allowing same-sex marriage? And so I wanted to do what I could to answer that. So let me give you 4 consequences, all 4 of which follow the general rubric of ideas have consequences and bad ideas will have bad consequences. That what the Supreme Court's ruling will do, and it's already starting to do, is it will further replace in our culture the idea that marriage is a comprehensive union of sexually complementary spouses where they live by the demands of monogamy, exclusivity, and permanency. And it will replace it with the revisionist view of marriage that came out of the sexual revolution. It will now enshrine that in our law and in our culture, that marriage is about consenting adult romance of whatever size or shape the adults most desire. The law can't teach both of these things simultaneously. It will teach one or it will teach the other. And the law will then shape our culture. Our culture will then shape our beliefs. And then our beliefs will shape our actions. And not just for you in the audience, but for your children and for your children's children. That what the law teaches, what the public schools teach, what Hollywood promotes, they all have an impact of shaping our culture and our beliefs and our actions. So let me go through these one by one. First, now that Justice Kennedy has redefined marriage to make it a genderless institution, there is no institution left in public life that even upholds the ideal that every child deserves both a mother and a father. What redefining marriage does is say that men and women are interchangeable, mothers and fathers are replaceable. It strikes me that it'll be very hard for the President Obama that says we know the statistics and then rattles off all of the consequences of growing up without a father to say that fathers are essential now that the law has redefined marriage to make fathers optional. It strikes me that the pedagogical function of the law is to teach that marriage is now about consenting adult romance, more about the desires of the adults involved rather than the needs or the rights of the children involved. The second consequence that I mentioned in that chapter is that the redefinition of marriage has no logical reason to stop here. And the best way of highlighting this is to simply introduce you to 3 new words that activists have devised to describe where they want the redefinition of marriage to go next. The first is the term throuple. Throuple being a 3-person couple. This was in New York Magazine about 5 years ago, and it was 3 men in Brooklyn who were living with each other and loving each other. They sleep with each other, they cook meals for each other, they want to have a joint checking account, they want to file joint tax returns. On the Anthony Kennedy philosophy of marriage, where marriage is about consenting adult romance and caregiving, these 3 men have a marriage. And so if you have been supporting marriage equality and you went before the US Supreme Court and demanded marriage equality for the same-sex couple, on what basis could you deny marriage equality to the same-sex throuple? Or to the opposite sex quartet? Sexual orientation, complementarity will brook no difference here. The idea here would be any ensemble of consenting adults who love each other and want to live with each other and want to care for each other should now go by the legal title of marriage. And we already have lawsuits in the federal courts asking for a constitutional right to practice polygamy. Polyamory will be around the corner, simply as a logical matter. Because the way that we arrived at monogamy in both Western law and culture is that it's one man and one woman who can unite in the act that can create new life, and every new life has one mother and one father. And marriage law and marriage policy was about encouraging that man and that woman to unite in a permanent, stable, exclusive relationship. But once you say the male-female part of marriage is irrational and arbitrary, once you say the mothering and fathering aspect of marriage is neither here nor there, once you say the procreative aspect of marriage is arbitrary and outdated, what is your principled basis for monogamy? What's magical about the number 2 once you say male-female is irrational? So that's the throuple. The next term was in the New York Times Sunday magazine. It's the word monogamish. Monogamish is a play on the word monogamous. So this is a 2-person relationship, but it's a sexually open relationship. That's what the ish at the end is meant to highlight. The title of the article that the New York Times gave this was Married, with Infidelities. Because what the profilee, the subject of the profile, Dan Savage, was arguing was that straight couples could learn from gay couples the virtue of the open relationship. He was saying that infidelity need not be viewed as a vice. You could view your marriage as having the virtue of a monogamish relationship. That one of the problems with the way straight people, especially in Western cultures, practice marriage is that they expect it to be sexually exclusive. But this is an outdated, inhumane holdover of Judaism and Christianity, and it would be much better if straight people learned from same-sex relationships that were much more fluid, much more open. And he said that the romantic caregiving part of marriage is actually enhanced when you're free to seek out sexual fulfillment with other partners. And so Savage was arguing in this New York Times story that straight marriage would actually become a better thing after marriage has been redefined because straight couples would learn from gay couples the virtue of the open relationship. Lastly is the term wed lease. This was in the Washington Post 2 years ago. Wed lease is a play on the word wedlock. Just like wedlock is meant to kind of conjure up an image of something strong and sturdy and permanent, wed lease is meant to do the opposite. Just like you can lease a car or you can lease a house, you should be able to lease your spouse. Or that was what this lawyer in the Washington Post was arguing. He was saying that the problem with the way Western societies practice marriage is that they expect it to be permanent. This is an outdated holdover of Judaism and Christianity. Marriage should simply last as long as the love lasts. And rather than just going to no-fault divorce, which was the first step of the reform, he was saying, why not just have temporary marriage licenses in the first place? Sign up for a 5-year wed lease. If it's going well, you can renew it. If it's not going well, it would just automatically dissolve. Now, whatever you might think about the theology or the morality of thruples and wed leases and monogamish relationships, I'll leave that for you to ask your theology professors. Let me just say a word about the public policy consequences. I argue that the reason the state got in the marriage business was to encourage a man and a woman to commit permanently and exclusively to each other so that any children that they might have would have both a mother and a father. The wed lease, the throuple, the monogamous relationship directly undercut the public purpose of marriage because they increase the number of sexual partners that men and women have, and then they decrease the amount of commitment that men and women make to each other. The throuple, the monogamous relationship, those are increasing your sexual partners. The monogamous relationship and the wed lease, those are decreasing the amount of commitment that you make to your partners. What does that recipe create? It creates more fragmented families. It creates more fatherless children. The exact outcome that marriage policy was trying to prevent in the first place. And yet all three of these words, the throuple, the wed lease, the monogamous relationship, follow as a logical matter, just like night follows on day, once you get rid of male-female sexual complementarity. If you say marriage is just about consenting adult romance and caregiving, there's no reason why it can't be between 3, 4, or more people. There's no reason why it should be expected to be an exclusive relationship. There's no reason why it should be expected to be a permanent relationship. These are all equal choices, and the state shouldn't favor one above the others once you get rid of the central purpose of marriage. Let me move on to the third consequence that's in this second chapter. And this is the consequence for unborn human life. And I approach this topic in two ways in that chapter. The first is simply at the level of worldview. It's not that it's impossible to make the following argument. It's just that I've never heard anyone make the argument. I've never heard someone argue simultaneously both for same-sex marriage and for chastity. Again, it's not because it's impossible to do so. It's just that the general worldview that has prevailed in the redefinition of marriage is the worldview of which consenting adults should do whatever consenting adults want to do. That provided the action is consensual, it's no one else's business. What we know from the statistics on abortion is that a significant driver of the demand side of abortion is non-marital sexual relations, particularly premarital sexual relations, that creates the crisis pregnancies, many of which end up in abortion. So if the general worldview that Kennedy has now enshrined into our Constitution and further into our culture is one of which the sexual revolution prevailing, in which consenting adults or even now consenting teenagers should do whatever the consenting individuals want, it strikes me that it will lead not to a decrease in the abortion rates, but an increase of the prevalence of crisis pregnancies. So that'll be one way in which the further undermining of the institution of marriage will have consequences for the abortion debate and for unborn human life. There's also a more particular way in which it'll have consequences for unborn human life. We're already seeing that one of the demand side of assisted reproductive technologies are same-sex couples who desire a child of their own. And again, this is the same way in which I started by quoting Daniel Patrick Moynihan. There's a problem that heterosexuals cause that's now being exacerbated through the redefinition of marriage. Very similar here, assisted reproductive technology is a problem that heterosexuals created, totally unregulated in the United States, and it will now be exacerbated by the redefinition of marriage. Because many same-sex couples will desire a child of their own. Same-sex relationships on their own can't produce children. Adoption doesn't provide them with a child of their own. There will be an increase in the rates of surrogacy, of sperm donation or sale, of egg donation or sale. I don't know what the advertising requirements are in the Observer or the Irish Rover. When I was an undergraduate, the campus paper would regularly have advertisements for ova. They were willing to buy Princeton undergraduate eggs from anywhere between $50,000 to $100,000 per harvesting cycle. What's going to happen here is we'll see an increase in the demand on the egg supply and an increase in the demand on the surrogacy side of things. So you'll exploit women who feel that they need to either rent their rooms or sell their eggs because same-sex couples are unable to produce children on their own. The reason I say that this has consequences not just for the women who will be put in this position, but also for the unborn children is that assisted reproductive technology is simply thoroughgoingly throughout an instance of embryo destruction. Many more embryos are created than will ever be implanted. Of the embryos that are implanted, many are selectively reduced. That's the jargon for aborted. So a typical cycle of IVF will create maybe a dozen eggs, half of which will be placed in a freezer, the other half will be implanted. Of those implanted embryos, they will then be reduced to the one child the couple actually wants to have delivered 9 months later. And so if you care about unborn human life, you have to think about how redefining the nature of the family will redefine the creation of children. In a subsequent chapter, I take this one step further, simply by quoting some of the children of same-sex couples who have said that redefining marriage creates an institution for missing parents. But I'll highlight that in a moment. For now, I just want to highlight how redefining marriage redefines parenthood and therefore redefines childhood at its creations, at the very beginning of life. The last consequence that I mention in this chapter, and then it goes on for 3 ensuing chapters, is for religious liberty. This is why the subtitle of the book takes the form of The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom. The simplest way of highlighting this is to say that if you've heard people say throughout the past decade that if you're against same-sex marriage, you're no better than the racist bigot who was against interracial marriage, believe them. They meant it. And now that they are in the ascendancy of cultural and political power, they intend on treating people who believe marriage is the union of a man and a woman as if they're racists or bigots. That for the past 10 years, that wasn't just a debater's point, that wasn't just a scare tactic. It's something they actually believe. All 4 of the dissenting opinions in this most recent Supreme Court case pointed out that by Anthony Kennedy redefining marriage, he has stigmatized those individuals and communities that believe marriage is the union of a man and a woman, and that his opinion will be used to further penalize them. The 4th chapter of the book goes through about a dozen different cases of institutions and individuals who have already been penalized by the government because of the redefinition of marriage. It starts by looking at Catholic charity adoption agencies in Massachusetts, in Illinois, and where I live in Washington, D.C. These are agencies that were taking care of orphans long before state agencies even existed. They were caring for the least among us. They were helping children find homes with married moms and dads. When the state redefined marriage, they said unless you place children with same-sex married couples on an equal footing as you do with married mothers and fathers, you're discriminating and you're violating our anti-discrimination code, and we won't give you the license to run an adoption agency if you're going to be discriminating. And so in those 3 jurisdictions, Catholic charities and other Christian-run adoption agencies were forced to shut down. This does absolutely nothing to help children. This doesn't make it more likely that more children find homes with more parents. Reducing the number of adoption providers simply scores a point for political correctness. Catholic Charities wasn't trying to prevent gays and lesbians from adopting from other adoption providers. They weren't saying that the state agency can't place children with same-sex couples. All they asked for was the freedom to run their ministry in accordance with their beliefs. It's not just the adoption agencies. We've seen Gordon College, an evangelical school up in Massachusetts, was investigated about whether or not it would keep its accreditation because it has an on-campus policy, a code of conduct for all Gordon College members that it asks them to live up to the Christian virtue of chastity. Chastity understood as sexual relations are reserved for marriage, understood as evangelical Christians understand it, a union of husband and wife. And for that, the accrediting agency said, we think you might be a little too bigoted and we're going to have to investigate this. And it was only after a public backlash that the accrediting agency backed off. But to show you that this isn't a long-term landing pad, during oral arguments at the Supreme Court, Justice Alito asked the Solicitor General of the United States, Donald Verrilli, if this court redefines marriage, what's going to happen to the nonprofit tax status of all of the institutions of civil society that continue believing marriage is the union of a man and a woman? Alito said, we have the precedent of Bob Jones University, where this court denied them a religious liberty exemption when they lost their nonprofit tax status by the IRS because they had a policy prohibiting interracial dating. He said, will the same thing happen to these Christian and Jewish and other schools that have marriage understood as a union of man and woman. The Solicitor General said, I don't deny it, Justice Alito, that's going to be an issue. I don't deny it, it's going to be an issue. He said it twice. Now, most lawyers would just lie to the judge to tell the judge whatever he wants to hear so the judge rules in his favor. And so Varelli wasn't even willing to lie to the court to say, oh no, we'll never treat Orthodox Jews and Roman Catholics and evangelicals and Latter-day Saints and Muslims and all sorts of other religious communities who believe the book of Genesis matters. We won't treat any of those people differently because of this Supreme Court ruling. He wasn't willing to say that. He wasn't willing to say, oh no, interracial marriage is night and day different than same-sex marriage, and we would never use a precedent to treat Orthodox Jews and Roman Catholics and evangelicals as if they're racists. That's not what he said. What he said was it's going to be an issue. 2 days after the Supreme Court rules on the marriage decision, the New York Times religion columnist wrote an op-ed for Time magazine with the title, Now's the Time to End Tax Exemption for Religious Institutions. He was saying, now that the court has redefined marriage, this is the time to stop treating religious institutions as nonprofit institutions. And there's a certain element in the political left that would like that because it sees religion as a force for evil, and it thinks that government would be better off providing education and social services themselves. So they view it as a twofer. They can win on their big government agenda and their anti-religion agenda. We've then seen cases in the private sector, bakers, florists, photographers, various professionals who have no problem serving gay and lesbian customers, but they do have a problem helping to celebrate a same-sex wedding. They say that they can't in good conscience use their God-given artistic gifts and talents to help celebrate what they believe is a lie about God's plans for marriage. One of the best-known cases involves a 70-year-old grandmother in Oregon, Baronelle Stutzman. She's had gay employees, and she was selling flowers to this particular gay couple for a decade. When they came in and they asked, can you do our wedding flowers? And she sat down with the guy, his name's Roger. She speaks as if they're friends. She was selling flowers for them for a decade. She had no problem doing get well soon flowers and happy birthday flowers. She sat down and said, this is why I can't do your wedding flowers, because of what I believe as an evangelical about marriage. Several days later, she was sued by the Attorney General of the state of Oregon for violating the human rights statute, the anti-discrimination statute for that state. She was apparently discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation, even though she's had gay employees and she sells flowers to gay people all the time. It was simply her belief that marriage is the union of a man and a woman that the state was now reinterpreting as discrimination. And it has fined her. She's been sued in both her professional and her personal capacity. So she risks losing both her business and her home. And she's still in the appeals process. In the neighboring state of Washington, a young evangelical couple, Aaron and Melissa Klein, used to run a bakery called Sweet Cakes by Melissa. They were asked by a same-sex couple to bake a cake for their wedding. They explained why they couldn't do it. They were then sued. They've been fined $135,000 for the emotional damages that they caused by not baking the same-sex wedding cake. They've appealed this, but in the meantime, they've had to shut down their business. This is the business that used to provide for their 4 small children. The husband's now a trash collector, and that's how he provides for his family. It's not as if in the state of Oregon or Washington, which are rather progressive, left-leaning West Coast jurisdictions, that evangelical Christians have a monopoly on cake baking or floral arrangements. There was no real need for the government to say that every photographer and every baker needs to be celebrating same-sex weddings. There are many, many bakers and florists who are in favor of gay marriage. They're also in favor of making money. And so this would seem like the instance in which you would say, live and let live. If you're in favor of gay marriage, bake the cake and make the money. If you're not in favor of gay marriage, don't bake the cake and you don't get this sale. And we can let the markets sort these things out. And there's no need for government interference. And yet we've seen time and time again that these cases have come, sometimes looking as if they've been intentionally chosen as to which caterer, which florist, which baker was going to be asked precisely to get the desired outcome. Because at the end of the day, it seems much more that this is not about a live and let live movement as much as it is about silencing any opposition. So what I suggest in The fifth chapter is that this is probably true only for the most elite, the activists, the ideologues on the left on this issue. That ordinary Americans, even those in favor of same-sex marriage, aren't in favor of government coercion. Ordinary Americans, even those who are in favor of same-sex marriage, when they hear these stories, they're shocked as well. They say, look, I was in favor of same-sex marriage because I thought it was about tolerance and pluralism and coexistence. And when I hear these stories about government shutting down adoption agencies or fining bakers and florists, it makes me sick to my stomach. So what I try to do in those middle chapters is appeal to them to say, look, you can be in favor of gay marriage and also be in favor of liberty and freedom. That you need not follow the activists and the ideologues within your own side of the political spectrum. And here I model, again, to the pro-life movement. After Roe v. Wade, there were some activists and ideologues that wanted to say abortion is a constitutional right, abortion is health care like any other health care, therefore every doctor and every nurse in every hospital should be forced to perform abortion or assist at abortion or pay for abortion. And thankfully, those activists and those ideologues lost that debate. The pro-lifers won through a variety of policy measures, most importantly, the Church Amendment, named for Senator Church, not for an ecclesial community. But what the Church Amendment said was that it was a federal law that protected healthcare workers from having to assist or perform an abortion. It's what makes it possible to be an evangelical or a Catholic and be a physician, to be a nurse, to run Catholic hospitals. It was vitally important that that principle was established. And the way that this principle was established was that you got a number of people who were pro-choice who said, look, I disagree with the Catholic nurse, I disagree with the evangelical doctor, but I don't want the government forcing them to violate their beliefs. There was a sizable enough middle on this issue that said, look, I have family members who disagree with me about this issue. I don't think they're evil people. I don't want the government coercing them. And up until 3 or 4 years ago, this was a principle that was more or less respected in American politics. It's up until the HHS mandate that we had said that if you're pro-life, you shouldn't be forced by the government to pay for or perform abortion. And it's only with the HHS mandate that we're relitigating that case. Why do I think up until Obamacare this principle was honored? And I think it's that the average pro-choice citizen can understand what makes someone be pro-life. My average liberal classmate at Princeton, secularists, they're pro-choice, they disagree with me about abortion, but they at least understand why I'm pro-life. And it's precisely because they understand why I'm pro-life that they're unwilling to have the government coerce me. They say, look, we think Ryan's wrong about abortion, but we understand why he cares about the unborn child, and it would be wrong of us to have the government force him to violate his beliefs about such an important issue. My average Princeton classmate, even today, despite my best efforts, still doesn't understand why I believe what I believe about marriage. Unlike on the abortion issue, too many at the elite level on this marriage issue view people who support marriage as a conjugal union of man and woman as if they're not just wrong, but evil. And so it's going to be our challenge to appeal to middle America and say, look, you might have a disagreement with a brother or a sister, with your mom or your dad, your aunt and your uncle. Do you think they're the functional equivalent of Bull Connor? Do you think that they are the new iteration of intolerable racism that needs to be stamped out? Or is this much more like the abortion debate, a debate on which reasonable people of goodwill can disagree but coexist and live peaceably with each other even while disagreeing? And so what I do in the last 3 chapters is try to show how to make that argument. Because I think the problem here is that my average Princeton classmate hasn't read one of the books that I've written. My average Princeton classmate has heard from the Westboro Baptist Church. And they think that the Westboro Baptist Church is representative of conservative Christian beliefs in general. If you don't know who or what the Westboro Baptist Church is, that's a good thing. But because they're not, I think they're a heretical community because this is the community that will protest funerals with signs that say God hates fags. And the reason I think that's a heretical community is because God hates no one. But many people, especially in the media, love profiling the Westboro Baptist Church and highlighting them as if that's the only reason someone could be opposed to same-sex marriage. So one of the things that motivated Sharif and Robbie and I in doing the first book, and what motivated me in doing this second book, was to help equip people in how to make the argument for marriage properly understood, to explain what it is that we believe about marriage and why we think redefining marriage will have consequences. So that's what those first two chapters do. But then the last chapters look at some more recent scholarship. So the seventh chapter goes through the most recent social science on marriage and in particular same-sex parenting. If you remember that my general argument was that redefining marriage will have consequences for marriage as a whole and for everyone, that redefining marriage will impact everyone's understanding of what marriage is and what it requires of spouses. In the seventh chapter, I look specifically on same-sex parenting, which is a separate aspect of this argument. I don't think it's the main concern for me. The main concern for me is how redefining marriage changes marriage as a whole. But a secondary concern is how redefining marriage will have an impact on children of same-sex couples. And so I go through what social scientists have known for 40 years now. Marriage matters for kids. A child raised by their married mother and father is provided with the best environment for human flourishing. And social scientists point for three reasons why. They say biology matters, they say gender matters, and they say stability matters. And so biology, we know that having a double biological connection to the child seems to make a difference. Gender, we know that both mothering and fathering matters for a child, that mothers and fathers aren't interchangeable, that men and women bring different, distinct, but complementary gifts to the parenting enterprise. And then stability matters. The reason that cohabitation, divorce, and remarriage don't provide as good outcomes for children is because they aren't as stable. The most rigorous recent social science suggests that the same exact thing is true for children who are raised by same-sex couples. I go through showing that the 49 studies that the American Psychological Association relied on in its amicus brief when it said there was no differences between same-sex and opposite-sex parent, not a single one of those studies used a large random representative sample. And so from a non-representative sample, you can't draw any conclusions about a population as a whole. I then point to the only 8 studies that have been conducted to date that used large random and representative samples to investigate parenting across the family forms. So married, intact, biological family, single parenting, divorce and remarriage, cohabiting parenting, and then same-sex parenting. There have only been 8 studies that used large random representative samples, and those 8 studies have come to the same conclusion that the best place for a child is with the married mother and father. And I suggest that it's precisely because of what the earlier iteration of social scientists knew, that biology, gender, and stability matter, and that the same-sex parenting structure doesn't provide those same things in the same way. The next thing I do in that chapter is tell some of the stories of now adult children who were raised by same-sex couples. Because it was after the first of these studies was released. 3 years ago, Mark Regnerus released his study on family structure, that a young professor, he was untenured at the time, and he was in the UC school system. He wrote an essay for public discourse titled "Growing Up with Two Moms, the Untold Child Story." And he said he was raised by 2 mothers, that he loved his 2 moms, but he missed out on having a father. And it wasn't until the Regnerus study was published that he saw social science that revealed the reality of his life and of his childhood. After he told his story, several other now adult children of same-sex couples have given their testimonies. 6 of them filed amicus briefs with the U.S. Supreme Court explaining how redefining marriage will impact children like them. And the phrase that stuck with me, and I can't remember now if it was from Katie Faust or Heather Barwick, was that same-sex marriage creates an institution for missing parents. Both of these young women said that they loved their 2 moms, they missed out on having a dad, and that redefining marriage will create an institution for a missing parent, which is unlike single parenting or divorce. No one holds up single parenting or divorce parenting as the ideal. No one creates an institution to incentivize single parenting or divorce parenting. And what they were pointing out was that by redefining marriage, we were now creating a new institution which would incentivize the missing parent. And that the child wouldn't even now be allowed to say, hey, the missing parent is causing me concern, that I miss the dad that's not here, or I miss the mom that's not here, because the law and the culture would be saying, no, you're in an equal marriage. You have two moms, you have two dads. It's the same thing as a mom and a dad. And so one of them pointed out that a child of single parents can say, look, this is hard on me, I'm missing dad. The child of the divorced parent can say, this is hard on me, I'm missing mom. The child of same-sex parents isn't given that space or that freedom to say so. I quote the amicus brief that Bobby Lopez filed with the court, in which he's now seen 2 generations of children of same-sex couples, saying that now in which a child of a same-sex couple expresses this opinion, they're taken to see a therapist, and the therapist says that they are being homophobic themselves. That the problem's not with their family structure, the problem is with them for thinking that their 2 moms aren't enough. For thinking that they need a father, the problem is with the child. And he quotes the testimony of several children to that effect. One of the things that I thought was most interesting in this chapter, and it was a revelation to me as I was doing research for the book, was Heather Barwick tells a story. She was in favor of same-sex marriage. She grew up with 2 mothers. She was in favor of same-sex marriage because she wanted her 2 moms to have the right to marry. It wasn't until she got married to a man and she and her husband started having children and raising children together that she realized what she had missed out on by not having a father. That it wasn't even until she saw what her husband was doing for her children that she finally realized what had been lacking in her family and what she had always been looking for but never quite able to articulate. And so she tells the story of how she went from supporting same-sex marriage to being an opponent of it. The reason I mention this science, the social science in these stories, is that in a similar way to the pro-life movement, in which they found ultrasound and Feminists for Life and Silent No More and Women Speak for Themselves as effective ways of bearing witness to the truth, I also think on the marriage issue, it won't be traditional spokespeople, people who wear dark blue suits and ties, that'll be our most effective messengers on this. I think the social science will be helpful in revealing the realities. I don't think social science is as immediate as an ultrasound image. I don't think it's as convicting as the undercover videos from Planned Parenthood. So I'm not fooling myself on how effective I think it'll be. But I do think over time the social science will bear out the essential truths of human nature. And then I think some of these other spokespeople, people who can tell their stories about growing up with 2 parents, or even more powerful, gays and lesbians themselves who are against same-sex marriage. I tell the story of Doug Mainwaring in that chapter, a gay man who's against gay marriage. And he explains why, from his perspective, that he thinks his children need both a mother and a father, regardless of his own sexual desires and orientation. The 8th chapter is the only chapter that's specifically addressed to the church, and the only chapter that actually engages in some theological thinking. The rest of the book's based on philosophy and social science and constitutional law. It simply says that the problem that we're witnessing here is a cultural problem that we've failed to address for 40-some years. And so it gives 4 pieces of advice to religious communities, churches in particular, but I think it would be applicable to any religious community. The first of which is we need to develop a coherent, consistent, and compelling response to the sexual revolution. The majority of our own community members, our own children and grandchildren, are having their moral imaginations and their worldview shaped more by Hollywood than by the Gospels when it comes to human sexuality in the family. And that we haven't done enough to provide an effective way of transmitting our values to our own young people. And so again, before even getting to the same-sex part, I just want to focus on the marriage part. Unless we can find a way of presenting monogamy, exclusivity, and permanency in a compelling way, we will make no headway on this. The second was to say that the other lecture that's going on simultaneously with Eve Tushnet, that is to be promoted and fostered. We need more explicit ministries to people with same-sex attraction who desire to live out the virtue of chastity. We need this at both the institutional level and the personal level. So I mentioned the Catholic Apostolate Courage. I mentioned the documentary that they've made, The Desire of Everlasting Hills. But I also challenge readers to say you can't outsource this to the professionals. If you're not in favor of same-sex marriage, what are you in favor of for people who have same-sex attraction? Every human being has an innate desire for community. Every human being has a desire for intense relationships with other people. If those who are same-sex attracted will never marry, what do you want for their lives to flourish? And how are you helping them to lead flourishing lives? And Thanksgiving and Christmas, everyone needs somewhere to celebrate the holidays, a dining room table to have the meal. Are you inviting them into your families? Are you having them be big brother or big sister, aunt and uncle, godfather and godmother to your children if they're never going to have children of their own? How are we engaging same-sex attracted individuals in a welcoming, loving way? And that this is really, to a certain extent, the first generation in human history to wrestle with that question in an open format. And so it really is it's a task now for people to be thinking about how best to respond. The third is simply the religious liberty aspect. Not so much the policy or the legal aspect, but what do you do if you're the baker, you're the florist, you're the photographer, you're the administrator at the university? How should you respond if you're faced in this situation? Both what you should do, but also how should you do it? It's remarkable to me that the individuals who are most Christ-like, the most compassionate, the most generous, the most charitable in how they spoke to their clients, tend to do better in the court of public opinion than the ones who behave more like the Westboro Baptist Church. So it's a task here of how do you help prepare people for navigating this new situation. And then lastly, the fourth task for the church is simply helping its members live out the truth. If the past 40 years would have been 40 years of permanent, exclusive, monogamous husbands and wives loving each other till death do them part, with no adultery and with no non-marital childbearing and with no fault divorce, it strikes me as highly unlikely that the Supreme Court would have redefined marriage. And so the question here is, what can we do to actually live out the truth about marriage? I close the book by citing Pope Benedict, who says that it's not the arguments of the philosophers or the theologians that win converts, it's the lives of the saints. And Benedict says this as a world-class intellectual himself. So here you have a world-class theologian saying, it's not my doctrinal work that's going to be winning converts. It's the life that I live and the life that I hope everyone is living. It's the lives of the saints. If we can get more people to simply live the truth about marriage, that'll be the best defense of marriage in the long run. Let me close by saying one word about the last chapter. Throughout the book, I draw parallels between the pro-life movement and the pro-marriage movement. In the last chapter, I draw a longer historical parallel, and I draw a historical parallel from the church as a whole. What I say is that you can think of the challenge right now as simply the heresy of our day. The heresies for the early church, the heresies that Athanasius and Augustine were wrestling with, all focused on theology. Trinitarian theology and Christology. They focused on the nature of God, the nature of Jesus Christ. They all, if you think through your mandatory theology classes, think about what Augustine was doing in De Trinitate. Think about what Athanasius is doing. Think about all the various debates, how we get good insights into the nature of God. Fast forward 1,000 years, and the debates of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation are about the nature of the church and the nature of salvation. They're about ecclesiology and soteriology. Fast forward to today, the debates aren't so much about the nature of God or the nature of the church, they're about the nature of man. And I borrow this insight from John Paul II. John Paul had said before he became Pope that almost all of his intellectual work was ordered towards the question of the human person. And that he saw that all of the crises of the 20th century were the result of faulty anthropologies. They were a result of getting the human person wrong. In his context, it was the Second World War, the Holocaust, the totalitarian regimes, forms of government that viewed some human lives as disposable, that used some human lives as simply cogs in the wheel of the state. John Paul then extended that analysis into the biotech era when he writes the Evangelium Vitae, saying it's the same understanding that now inspires the disposal of unborn human life. I think if you look at our challenges today, whether it's about embryo destruction or cloning or abortion or marriage or transgendered issues, they all focus on the truth that we're created male and female, and that male and female are created for each other in marriage. That we're made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore we have innate dignity and intrinsic worth, and that we come male and female meant for each other. It strikes me that these are going to be the challenges for the church in the 21st century. These are some of the challenges that the readings yesterday at Mass highlighted. These are some of the challenges that the Synod right now in Rome will be wrestling with, and that we're going to need good academics, philosophers and theologians and social scientists, pastors and preachers, grassroots people, mothers and fathers, husbands and wives, simply living this stuff out, thinking it through, and responding to these challenges. And so the book closes by putting it in that longer and larger historical framework of taking the long view. This is simply a blip within the life of the church and its understanding of the nature of God and the nature of man. So with that, I'll stop. The floor is open, and we have some time for questions.
Thank you, Doctor. So we've got 2 microphones for questions. So just raise your hand and we'll kind of just take the microphone to you so everyone can hear the question. Do I see hands? I guess back there's questions. I'll do one thing.
The question is, I have a lot of libertarian friends, a pretty intelligent libertarian brother who argues against the utility of the law. And I'm sure you've heard these arguments where, how do you tell 2 or however many consenting adults what they can and cannot do in the privacy of their own home? And I understand the arguments for why the state should incentivize marriage, but it's still tough to argue against that there is this libertarian idea, I guess.
Yep, great question. So the libertarian argument can go in one of 2 ways, and I'm not sure which way your libertarian friend was taking it, so I'll reply to both. The first libertarian argument is that, well, how can you say 2 gay people shouldn't be free to live how they want to live? And the answer to that question is, I don't. I say they should be free to live how they want to live. And this is the thrust of Clarence Thomas's dissenting opinion. He says, same-sex couples do have liberty right to live and to love how they want to. And Anthony Kennedy, you can't take a liberty interest and turn it into government recognition. That for the past decade, in all 50 states, 2 men or 2 women were free, legally allowed to live with each other, to love each other, to go to a house of worship and have a marriage ceremony performed. They were free to work for a progressive business and receive marriage benefits if the house of worship chose to, if the business chose to. It was a libertarian paradise. They were free to do what they wanted to do, churches free to do what they wanted to do, businesses free to do what they wanted to do. The state simply said, we're out of it. We have a marriage policy that we try to promote while respecting your freedom and liberty to live how you want to live. What's now taken place is that the state has redefined marriage, and the question is, how many institutions is the state now going to coerce into embracing the new definition of marriage? Most people seem to think that it's not going to coerce the church itself. It's not going to force Catholic priests to perform same-sex weddings, but it's not clear if it's going to coerce Catholic universities or Catholic charities or Catholic adoption agencies or Catholic grade schools or the baker, the florist, the photographer. We're uncertain. So the libertarian should be very concerned that actually what it looks like is the government has redefined an institution of civil society and is now coercing other people into embracing it. So that's the argument to the first libertarian objection. It's that, look, we're not violating anyone's liberty. We have a policy that both tries to promote the truth about marriage while leaving other arrangements free. The other libertarian argument was, well, why don't you just get the government out of the marriage business? So it looks like he was going more in that direction. And so here, I think the problem here is that your church can marry you, but your church can't divorce you or do a paternity test or enforce alimony payments or child support payments. This will actually be a libertarian nightmare. Because what we've already seen is just through the cultural breakdown of marriage, it's led to the growth of the state. The leading driver of the explosion for the past 40 to 50 years of the welfare state, the police state, the prison population has been the breakdown of marriage. Because decisions that once used to be made locally by a family are now being made ad hoc by judges, by police officers, by welfare departments. And so there's a giant growth of the state as marriage breaks down. Now imagine you just didn't have marriage in the first place. You would have to, rather than having an institution that would channel men and women to commit to each other and to their children, you would now have legal proceedings on a one-by-one basis to determine who has duties to this child, who's going to enforce those duties to this child, what's going to happen if the adults don't live up to those duties. It will lead to a growth of both juridical proceedings in the court and to government spending in various welfare programs and other kind of ways in which the state picks up the pieces. So that's how I would apply to the kind of like libertarian utopia of we'll just leave everything to consenting adults. Institutions matter. And one of the ways that you actually limit government is by respecting institutions of civil society. Other questions?
Hi there. So in your talk, you spent a lot of time talking about the link between the pro-life kind of aspect and the pro-marriage aspect. My concern is with, since Roe versus Wade started off, there's always been a limiting principle, right? First it was the trimester framework, then they had the viability framework. So there's always been some sort of legal basis on which attacks could be made against, for restrictions for abortion. But with this decision, it doesn't really seem like there's any limiting principle there. It's just, hey, they kind of have a throwaway nod to, oh, maybe there might be something, but there's really no hard limiting principle there. So how does, I guess, the pushback kind of work with this?
Yeah, great question. So let me just say one thing about the Roe v. Wade. You're right that Roe originally was in a term of frameworks, a framework of trimesters, but its companion case, Doe v. Bolton, defined what would be kind of like the causes to go beyond that, which included women's health as including psychological health, which was then interpreted as more or less being any condition on which pregnancy would be viewed as a burden. So don't forget that the first time the federal government banned partial birth abortion, it was struck down as being unconstitutional. And it was only the second time that they, no, we really meant this, that it was upheld. And right now we're seeing whether or not the fetal heartbeat and the fetal pain and the 20-week bills will be upheld. There have been a variety of outcomes, both pro and con, in the federal courts, and it looks like sometime soon these will be appealed to the Supreme Court. Which is just to say that you're right that the trimester framework and then the undue burden framework was there, but it looked like it was more window dressing than not, given how it was extended, that we actually needed to pass a bill against the Born Alive Infant Protection Act and then the partial birth abortion ban. That said, the marriage case is even worse. Because as Chief Justice John Roberts points out, there's no limiting principle to Kennedy's opinion. Roberts says that Kennedy randomly inserts the adjective to throughout his opinion, but never explains what would actually justify the limitation of marriage to two consenting adults. That the historical explanation was that it was both male and female. What I suggest we do is that we point out that we're actually better than our logic. Because the logic of abortion is also the logic of Peter Singer. If you follow the logic of abortion all the way to its conclusion, you're where the Princeton bioethicist Peter Singer concludes that infanticide is morally okay up until around age 2. And thankfully, people aren't that logically consistent. They recognize, no, there's something wrong with that, and it's led people to move in the other direction. Right? And so they say, wait, if there's nothing magical about the birth canal, then maybe partial birth abortion's wrong, maybe 20 weeks, and you keep chipping it back in that direction. I would say that what we want to do here is preserve as much truth as we can. So some people say, well, should we just rush down and take it to its logical conclusion and embrace the throuple and the monogamish and the wed lease? And I suggest against doing that. I think we want to actually preserve the goodness that remains, because marriage matters, and for as many people as possible who can still be monogamous and exclusive and strive for a permanent relationship, it'll make a difference. But what we ultimately want to do is say those three norms can only be justified in a fully rational way because of the sexual complementarity of the relationship in the first place. That if you can get someone to say, yeah, it should be permanent, it should be exclusive, it should be monogamous, ask them why. And you'll ultimately be driving them into the conclusion because it's a union of man and woman, husband and wife, mother and father.
Thanks for a wonderful presentation. A question and maybe a comment if I have time to do this. Now, let me disclose who am I. I teach marriage here. And I have been in circumstances where, as a black person, in major Catholic organizations in this country, I am part of a panel to discussing this issue. And after putting out what I thought was good ideas, I get the response I often get is, oh, you a black person can't understand. Well, no, we are surprised that you are opposed to same-sex marriage. In fact, in one circumstance, I was at a panel where somebody was making a case about this. And I said, listen, from what I know, and I've traveled the world quite over, if any pope, no matter who he is, says anything for that same-sex marriage should be put on the same footing as heterosexual marriage, he will have a schism in the church. The next thing I heard was, oh, you guys can go back to Africa and do what you want.
Were you talking to Cardinal Casper?
Long before Cardinal Casper. That was 2 years before
he
Cardinal
said it,
Casper.
yeah.
But these are, so what kind of thing? If I'm in that situation, what do you say? And I'm looking at this person, I'm not bothered. I don't care what color I can't. It doesn't bother me at all. But I just look at this person wondering, these are very prominent Catholic theologians saying this. And so when you ask that the church be whatever, that I have my doubts. Because I ask myself, if anybody, a young scholar coming up today in many Catholic universities, who openly and strongly opposes same-sex marriage would get hired, in how many places would they hire? And if they're hired, how many places would they get tenured? So, and this is one of the problems John Paul II saw when he talked about, in Veritatis Splendor, he was worried that institutions, people like me, who should be teaching what the church is teaching. I'm not talking of you not having opinions, that they become inside saboteurs, if I may ask, of the whole system, and make it difficult for even the church to think coherently on this matter. What do you think? It's a very complex matter. And all these years I've done moral theology, I've written quite a lot. I've been all places, so I know what I'm talking about here. It is harrowing that you can't even have a good discussion and a good argument without people naming if your argument if people can't match your argument, they resort to color. Like in my case, or tell you that we can do this. The Africans can go back and do whatever they can, wherever they come from.
So,
I don't know if there's a question there, but
well, I mean, I agree with you in the sense that it's a problem. I am not expecting to be hired by most universities. I have a PhD from this university. I've been cited by the Supreme Court. I'll have a book coming out with Oxford University Press, and I doubt I would even be interviewed by most political science departments that have job openings for the next 10 years. And then after that, it'll probably get worse, because I think it'll get worse before it gets better. So, I mean, I haven't obviously experienced the type of, let's just call a spade, the type of racism that you've experienced, right? That because you're from this backwatered southern hemisphere, Africa, that's why you have this backwards thought process and this backwards theology. That's not what I've experienced. I've just experienced, well, you're just a bigot. But I think it's a huge problem in general that we can't actually have discussions about the arguments that undergird our viewpoint rather than kind of psychologizing the person. Because of your history, because of your ancestry, because of your country of origin, because of whatever, that's why you think what you think. Rather than simply saying, you're a theologian, let me see the theological arguments that you make for marriage and let me counter them with a different set of arguments. I just think in general, especially in Western developed nations, all forms of intellectual discourse have been politicized. Not just this question. I think this question probably is the most extreme and the most severe and the most consequential, that if you have politically incorrect thoughts on this issue, you'll pay the biggest price. But I just think, the trigger warnings and the microaggressions and all the rest of that is just a bane on academic discourse and university life. It makes it harder to have the serious conversations that we should be having. Let me add one thing, because your question reminds me that I didn't mention that the 6th chapter of the book is titled Why Sexual Orientation is Not Like Race. Because I think what I heard at the beginning of your question, that people are surprised that as a black man you're not in favor of same-sex marriage, because don't you see that it's just like the bans on interracial marriage? And so they assume that because of your skin color you must think a certain way, which again is a form of racism. What I point out is that it shows a stunning amount of ignorance on the part of the questioner for not even knowing the history of the bans on interracial marriage contrasted with the recognition of marriage being a conjugal union. The bans on interracial marriage are a relative novelty in world history. The first political communities on the face of the earth to ban intermarriage on the basis of race are the U.S. colonies. It was a common law liberty in Europe and in England. And marriage had throughout history been a colorblind institution until the U.S. colonies introduced race to the equation to prohibit interracial marriage, to prop up their unjust system of race-based slavery and white supremacy. If you read Augustine and Aquinas, if you go further back and you read Plato and Aristotle, if you read Luther, Calvin, Kant, Locke, they don't talk about racial purity and marriage, but they talk about sexual complementarity and marriage. It was only with the slave trade, the race-based slave trade, and the white supremacy movement that people tried to prevent the races from uniting. But a good philosophy, like a good theology of marriage, will see that a man and a woman can unite as one flesh, regardless of their racial heritage, that a man and a woman can unite and create a child together regardless of their skin color, that children have a mother and a father and deserve to be raised by their mother and their father regardless of their race. And so that's why, from both a historical, a philosophical, and a theological perspective, the bans on interracial marriage are wholly and entirely unlike the nearly universal human witness on the importance of sexual complementarity. And so the problem now is to take an entire legal infrastructure that we've used to stamp out racism and say we're going to apply that legal infrastructure to now stamp out the belief that we're created male and female and that being united in marriage is what this sexual difference is all about, simply takes a bad set of premises and applies it to a viewpoint that's actually true, good, and beautiful. And unfortunately, the type of people who express surprise when you tell them you believe marriage is the union of a man and a woman want to treat you like a racist. They want to use all of the laws that have been used to prohibit and punish racism now apply to you because you have a homophobic or heterosexist view of marriage. And so anyway, that 6th chapter in the book is my attempt at responding to that. And we'll just go to the next question here.
Thanks for your talk, Ryan. One common response to an argument like yours is that if what you were saying were true, then the government ought not to allow infertile couples to get marriage licenses, and it's clear that the government's not checking in on marriages that do exist in opposite sex couples to make sure that they are having children. How do you respond to objections like that?
Yep. There are 4 different short answers to this at the end of chapter 1. So I'll say them briefly. The first is that public policy is always made at the rule, not the exception to the rule. And so the general rule here is that every child has a mother and father, not every marriage produces a child. And so from the state's interest, it's about getting a man and a woman to commit as husband and wife so that if it does produce any children, they'll have a mother and a father. The second is that there are all sorts of privacy concerns that no one on either side of this debate would want the state checking in on their fertility. Right? And so like regardless of what you think about this debate, you wouldn't want a fertility test when you apply for your marriage license, which is why historically marriage hasn't been premised on fertility, which leads to the third reason. It's that what marriages are comprehensive unions of husband and wife. Why states care about them is that for the most part, this union of husband and wife does produce a child, and that child does need both a mother and a father. So a marriage that never results in a child, an infertile marriage, a marriage between people past the age of menopause, is still a real marriage. It still unites husband and wife as one flesh. If every marriage was like that, the state probably would treat it the way that the state treats baptism and bar mitzvah, as something that's wholly a religious institution. There wouldn't be the public concern if every marriage was infertile, but that's not to say that infertile marriages are somehow non-marital. And then the fourth reason that I point out is that recognizing non-fertile or infertile marriages as marriages doesn't create any costs. It doesn't send a signal that men and women are interchangeable. It doesn't send a signal that 2 moms or 2 dads is the same thing as a mom and a dad. It doesn't in any way alter the pedagogical purpose of marriage, which is that men and women should unite permanently and exclusively so that kids, if they do come about, would have a mom and a dad. So think about it this way. It's that policy is based on the rule, not the exception to the rule. There are privacy concerns here. An infertile marriage is still a real marriage, and recognizing it by the state doesn't come with any costs. And so that's the quick kind of response. In the middle.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask about the social science. Of course, this is a complex topic. You can't get into everything. I mean, yeah, fair enough. But I forget exactly the set of qualifications you gave for the 8 studies. But like Rosenfeld's study had a large random sample. It seemed to suggest that the kids of gay parents were doing fine. Douglas Allen reanalyzed the study, criticized it, but I think there are a lot of reasons to think the controls he used probably biased the results. The Regnerus study, which you cited, of course, had a lot of problems with misclassification of respondents, comparing all gay couples to the most stable heterosexual couples, these sorts of things. So, again, I mean, I'm sure that there's a lot more to be said. We have competing it. Yeah, right.
I mean, you don't draw any big conclusions from 8 studies.
Yeah, but I don't know. I worry that the description you gave of the research maybe would be misleading about like the overall state of.
Sure. So let me say a couple words about it. I mean, so what I was trying to communicate there is that there had been like a 40-year consensus among social scientists on the importance of the married, intact mother-father family for children. So much so that you actually had social scientists changing their opinions. Normally the way that academic change takes place is that one generation of scholars dies and then a younger generation of scholar promotes a new view. You actually saw here, there was a question about no-fault divorce and about cohabitation. Many social scientists said it'll be better for children to get them out of conflict-ridden marriages. Children will be just fine provided it's a stable relationship with an adult. And you saw social scientists saying, no, we were wrong. What we thought would turn out wasn't the case. You even get the Atlantic Monthly running that cover story by Barbara Defoe Whitehead titled Dan Quayle Was Right. I mean, after everyone had mocked him for criticizing the TV show Murphy Brown for glamorizing single parenthood. What I wanted to draw from that was then if you move to the question, all right, so that 40-year consensus had looked at single parenting, divorce and remarriage, and cohabitation, and it found that none of those 4 alternatives produced as good results for children. There then were these 49 studies that the APA cites in its amicus brief saying that actually same-sex parenting is the same thing as married mothers and fathers. And it's the guy at LSU, Lauren Marks, the professor at LSU, Lauren Marks, who did the investigation and said not a single one of those 49 studies used a large random representative sample. Which is the, so that wasn't out yet, right? So Rosenfeld is a more recent study, right? And that's, as you point out, that's going to be criticized by Douglas Allen, which is that they're coding mistakes in the Rosenfeld study, that actually many of the couples that he says were same-sex couples weren't actually same-sex, and some of the ones that he says were opposite sex were actually same-sex. So, I mean, there's a problem in simply how we coded the data. My point is, why would we now think that all of a sudden the one exception to this rule would be the same-sex parenting environment, where there's not the gender complementary of parenting, there's not the double biological connection, and it seems that stability will be an open question, given what a variety of scholars and activists say about monogamy and exclusivity and permanence inside of same-sex relationships. I then point that there are only 8 studies that use large random representative samples to show how this is now in its infancy. I think that people like Mark Regnerus will be vindicated, because I think that these early studies will be replicated with time, because human nature being what it is, the 40-year consensus will continue to play out the more it's studied. But with only 8 studies so far, I mean, I wouldn't say anything hard and fast as science has concluded, but I do think that the science will be helpful, because I foresee that the Regnerus study and the Paul Sullivan study and the Doug Allen study is more accurate than not. And what we have so far, it's the most accurate of the available studies. Other questions? Who has the microphone? Oh, over there.
Hi, thanks, Ryan. I wanted to get your thoughts on the what's been called the Utah Compromise as kind of a public policy approach, and how whether you A, would think that would be effective at a national level, and B, your take on how realistic it is that that may happen as well.
Gotcha. So let me first describe what it is, and then, because I don't know, if people here don't follow these things pretty closely, there's no reason why you should know what the Utah Compromise is. The Utah Compromise was a bill that was passed in the state of Utah. I can't remember now if it was before or after the Indiana RFRA debacle. But they tried to do both simultaneously, and what I mean by both was protect religious liberty and create a SOGI law, sexual orientation and gender identity anti-discrimination statute. So what Utah did was it passed a bill that would protect the religious liberty rights of various groups who have concerns about the redefinition of marriage, while also creating a law that protected against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, what the acronym SOGI stands for. I think it's, so your second question I'll answer first, I don't think there's much prospect for this in other states or at the federal level, because I think Utah is pretty unique in its heavily Mormon population that allowed for this sort of a compromise to take place. I also think it's ultimately going to be a bad idea because I think over time what we have seen is that the anti-discrimination law gets ratcheted up and it gets more muscular and it applies to more areas and it comes with more penalties, and then the religious liberty protections get watered down. And even if you just think within the past 5 or 10 years of just American public opinion and American practice on this, you've seen that over time the protections based on sexual orientation and gender identity have increased while the religious liberty applications of the existing laws have decreased. So that a Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is a bill that passed unanimously in the House, 97 votes in the Senate, Bill Clinton signs into law, when your state moves to implement it, all of a sudden it's like the second coming of Jim Crow. and you have all sorts of powerful economic forces, Apple and Salesforce and Angie's List and all sorts of these companies boycotting your state, and they're forced at the last minute to do this fix, which just guts the law. That's where I see the cultural forces moving. So any SOGI law that's created today, over time will increase in its strength, and any religious liberty exemptions that are applied to it will be watered down over time. And I can see 10 years from now someone saying, oh yeah, when we passed that Utah compromise, that was just to get the bigots to shut up. But now that it's 10 years later, we no longer need those religious liberty protections. Because now that it's 10 years later, every enlightened individual knows that there's no reason to care about sexual complementarity. And anyone today that still has a hang up about this really just needs to be brought into line. I could be wrong about this. I mean, predictions about the future are, worth what you're paying for it. So take it with a grain of salt. But that's how I see, especially when I speak at elite law schools, and I see that these are the students that are going to be the future legislators and judges and attorney general, and it frightens me. Looks like we have time for one more or no more. All right, I'm being cut off.
Yeah, actually, yeah, we're, sorry. Tim, if you want to.
Thank you all.
Thank you all for coming. Just remember that Ryan's book, Truth Overruled, is on sale in the back of the room for $16.99, and Ryan will be up there shortly to sign copies. Thanks.